Hey, what's up? It's Clayton Olson, and in this video, I'm going to be talking to friend, business partner, integral coach, relationship coach, Jack Butler.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Humbled by that introduction.
I'm trying to not take on those identities,
Yeah. Well, we're going to be interviewing him, and we're going to notice and navigate all the identities that is Jack Butler today. And the reason why I wanted to do this was because if you've been a follower of my channel for some time, you've probably seen Jack in a number of videos, and there's just a ton of content that we've put out there together. And Jack has recently started a YouTube channel that has been skyrocketing to success. I think he's at 20,000 subscribers so far. And if you've resonated with Jack's message over the years and you're wanting to know more about this guy, I highly encourage you to check out his channel. There's going to be a link to his channel below in the description. And there's a number of things that you talk about that come from all these different angles of the breadth of knowledge that you have. And it's been an absolute pleasure working with you and being business partners. We've created a course called Becoming the One, Relationship Ready, Becoming the One. And it's been an incredible journey over the last 2 years. So I would love to give these people a bit of insight into who you are and kind of how you got started on this journey. And then I can kind of dive in and follow my curiosity, and maybe we can open up some fun territory together.
Great.
So do you want to start us off with just like, how did you get into this place of really wanting to give this type of advice, this teaching, coaching people?
Yeah. I think I wanted it from a pretty young age in some ways. So when I remember, I studied psychology and politics at Cambridge University. I remember, you get to the end of the time there, and then they have this thing, they call it the milk round. It's where like the top employers come and try and they wine and dine you and try and get you to come and work for Goldman Sachs or Deloitte, like consultants and banks and lawyers. And it didn't really resonate with me. And what I wanted to do was kind of help people with some kind of life enhancing advice. And I remember back then wanting to be a coach, 20 years old. And most people kind of laughed at me, honestly. Were like, what are you going to coach people on? But I'd been influenced by some of the great sort of American personal development names.
Like who?
Like Tony Robbins, like Zig Ziglar and Les Brown and Brian Tracy. Sort of what I would think of as sort of classic American sort of motivational personal growth. Yeah. And I was like, that's sort of closer to what I want to do. And there was just no obvious kind of foothold into it. I remember creating like a business card as a 21-year-old where I was like, speaker, coach, author. And that was sort of like my aspirational thing that I wanted to live into. And what I ended up doing was actually helping teenagers and build a business with a business partner, Future Foundations, that still runs in the UK and runs immersive and residential programs for teens around confidence and agency and having a purpose and working out who you are. And that was kind of a bit revolutionary in some ways. Like we were a startup that was sort of bringing new ideas into what I saw as like the classic British educational system that's a little bit passé in some ways in terms of, okay, cool, we're learning all this, I learned Latin, I love languages. And how do you really lead a good life? How do you lead a wise life? How do you live a successful life? How do you know who you are? How do you know what you want? Like I felt like I'd had the best. Like I got a scholarship to a top independent school. I was pretty much top of my year at Cambridge. And I'm like, no one's talked to me about this stuff. And I'm like a product of, like a successful product of the system. Maybe we need to create a space where some of these conversations are kind of happening. So that was originally just I kind of had a bit of a dream that I wanted to help people talk about the real stuff in life. And that's the through line. Yeah. It's deepened, and I'm in way different territory now than I was, 15 years ago. Totally. But that's kind of the through line is, how can you be you? How can you be real? How can you be wise? How can you be good? Sort of like moral, philosophical growth.
Got it. And so this was the Future Foundations was primarily in your 20s?
Yeah.
Correct? Okay. And then what have you noticed? That was the through line. What has actually shifted externally for you? The through line was being yourself, authenticity, motivational teachings, and helping people become who they really are. How did that all change as you got older?
Yeah, I think the principal difference was the sort of external versus internal orientation. So I think most of what I was doing in my 20s was really helping people have a dream and have a vision for their lives. right? Like, who could you become? You know, and particularly, you know, we worked with a lot of kids that were from pretty rough backgrounds. You know, so sort of saying, hey, you know, you've had a hard life, you've got a tough upbringing, your schooling has not really engaged you, but like, you are an individual. There's a power that's unique in you. No one else is the authority on your potential. You can become something, and kind of instilling that hope in people. Hence, it was a bit more motivational. Then I think there's been much more of this shift for me of kind of like, who are you when you don't have an idealized self, right? Because that, at one stage of development, having this like really strong sense of like, oh, I want to become that person, right? I want to be the next Tony Robbins. That's really powerful. And then at a certain point, maybe there's a realization that, that almost becomes the barrier, because I don't want to be someone else. I'm not trying to model someone else. I'm actually trying to be myself.
That's
and
interesting.
to start dropping some of those narratives.
That seems like a really significant shift. And what happens when I hear you say that is, I'm imagining there's this way of Western self-development that is around creating this ideal image that we're moving towards as an individual, right?
Yep.
Who is the vision of who I want to be?
Yes.
And I can see that being incredibly important, and anybody that's watching,
so
right?
powerful.
Yeah.
And such a fun time of life as well. Like, knowing that, I felt so like, wow, the world is my oyster. I can become whatever I want to become. You know, I can become a millionaire if I really wanted to, or I could become, you know, self-help person, or I can, you know, live in another country, or I can, you know, speed learning and learn 27 languages. Like, it's almost like limitless possibility, because you're in the driving seat.
Yeah. So tell me, it sounds great, and anybody watching, I'm sure, can connect with that.
Yeah.
And say, okay, yeah, who doesn't want to be an achiever and create their life and really be in the driver's seat the entire time? What are the limitations of that? What's the shadow side of being in that position for too long that you discovered on your path?
I think what happened for me was my life just kind of got pulled away from underneath me in a way that I wasn't expecting. Like, I suddenly became apathetic about my work. And I basically ended up leaving my company, leaving the relationship I was in, and ultimately leaving the country in a very short space of time. You know, now looking back, I realize, you know, in some traditions they call it Saturn return. It's like there's this period between 28 and 32 where you are kind of being invited to become a bit more into your real you and drop some of the things that were motivating you in your 20s.
Was the apathy because you were achieving certain things and realizing that it wasn't giving you the fulfillment that you thought it would?
I think I was starting to dig into stuff like the integral worldview, which it started to help me see, like, oh, there's certain brands of personal development that don't feel that alive or authentic to me, and I could never quite put my finger on it. And then I started to read Ken Wilber, and it was like, oh, it's kind of possibly because it's a stage of development. And if you've mostly worked through that stage of development, you just end up wanting different things. It's almost like a cycle completes, and the thing that used to motivate you, like sometimes people get this with money, right? They pursue it, make a bunch of money, and then they're like, oh, that's not the big answer that I thought it was going to be. For me, I wasn't so motivated by money. I was more motivated by mission. And at a certain point, it's almost like that mission completed for me. And then I felt kind of empty and confused and apathetic. And, you know, now I understand it was almost like a layer of the onion was being peeled back. And then this sort of like deeper version of me. It's almost a bit like in my 20s, I didn't have as much humility as I have now in certain ways. I thought I had the answers, and really it was just about propagating those answers. Now I realize, wow, there's so much more mystery and so much more nuance of terrain. It's not like this is the one solution that everyone just needs to learn how to do this, create a vision for your life. It's like there's so many things that we don't know about development. You know, there's so many things that we don't know about genetics and epigenetics and soul contracts and paths, and, you know, how does something like astrology fit in with other worldviews? There's just this sort of put it this way, it's a bit like believing that everything happens in your country and then realizing that there's a whole world. And then it's a bit like realizing that your world is just a tiny fraction of the entire universe. I feel like that sort of happened for me, where I was like, oh, I used to think that I basically got it and everyone just needed to like learn this stuff. And now I'm like, who knows? Your development path and my development path may be so different that we can't even draw commonalities between them, or we have to be very careful about how we do that. And I also think I was starting to embark on what some spiritual traditions they call the journey home. And the journey home is about, I'm not looking for it out there. I'm not looking for external success. I'm not looking for a relationship to fill a gap. I'm not looking for money to fill a gap. I'm not even looking for a mission to fill a gap, because that's a bit more sophisticated. Most people are like, yeah, money, at the end of the day, that's a little bit like you're materialistic. But if you have a world-changing mission, often people think that's really cool, but it can just be another thing that's actually stopping you being alone and quiet and noticing, what is actually on the inside that if it were healed or integrated, I wouldn't even really be that excited to go and fulfill this thing. That's kind of what happened for me. That like sense that I've got to have a burning mission and a purpose, that dropped. And it's a little bit more like, who am I when I'm not that? When I don't have a big idea about Jack and his life and his mission and helping people and saving the world. Like, why do I need to save the world?
Yeah.
And that sort of started to become more interesting inquiry for me.
Do you feel like you've answered that question?
Why do I need to save the world? Or
who am I without that mission?
Yeah, it turns out who I am, in a sense, is a much less fixed identity, right? So I feel much more flexible and porous in some ways about who I am than, I'm a social entrepreneur, or I'm a world-changing this, or I'm a speaker or a coach. I'm totally happy to get into those roles as and when I need to, but it feels much less more important to me now.
So I've got to ask this question just to interrupt you.
Yeah.
How has this shift then in consciousness and going from external to internal, how have you seen this impact your relationships and connections that you create with people, whether it's friends, intimate partners?
Yeah. I think I'm more tolerant. Maybe my wife would disagree with this, but I have the experience that I'm a little more tolerant of, like, it doesn't just have to be one way. I think in the past I sort of thought like, yeah, kind of the way you're showing up might be a little bit limited, because actually I know that there's a better way of showing up. And I think I'm less convinced of that and more able to be with different types of being. Like if I gave you a political metaphor, it's like I grew up liberal and now I'm much more comfortable with conservative values. I don't identify as a conservative, but I kind of get what they're talking about. Whereas before I just thought it was like a limited worldview. And I feel like I'm a bit more like that when I relate to people. Like we may be really different. I maybe don't fully get you, but you've got more space and permission to be you, rather than in my 20s, I think I was trying to create, here is an ideal type that we can just roll out, that everyone should kind of want to be this. Everyone should want to be an entrepreneur. Everyone should want to be self-actualized. Everyone should want, and now I'm like, what do you want? If you don't want that, I can invite you to something, but there's not a sense that it's like one dominant narrative that we're trying to create. And when I look at a lot of American sort of classic personal development now, that's sort of what I feel like someone is saying, hey, I created this cookie cutter in my life and you can be like me, basically. And I'm less interested to be like you now. I'm more interested for you to really be like you. And so I think there's a little bit more space.
Interesting.
In connections.
Yeah, on one hand, I can imagine that when you've got that cookie cutter and anybody, whether they're a coach, teacher, is operating from this model of I've done it this way, therefore you should do it this way. Yeah. There's some sense of certainty that comes with that.
Absolutely.
And it can really provide, I think, insulation to followers from the unknown and the uncertainty, right? It can provide that confidence. But what I hear you saying is that you've experienced that as limiting, and now it's less about what I'm doing and more about over there, who are you actually being? What is your authentic truth?
Right.
It feels scarier. It could be scarier to some, right? To actually be like, oh, wow, I don't have a model to follow. I have to actually find out what's true for me on the inside.
Right.
How do you help facilitate that kind of atmosphere for somebody to be in that kind of inquiry?
Well, I think in the way that I coach, certainly when I'm at my best, I think there's a decent amount of allowingness. So it's like I'm not trying to impose a view or model on someone. I might have some clear ideas about, hey, this might be something that seems like it's blocked. Yeah. Or the way that I hear you talking, it sounds like you're not allowed to be X. Yeah. And maybe it's okay to be X, or maybe you have a judgment on Y. And if we relax that judgment, you get to be you more. I think a lot of the work I've done is actually helping people locate the things that are in their shadows and say, okay, follow your judgments. Notice the things that you tend to criticize in other people and get curious. And this is still plenty of work for me to do this today on myself. Yeah. Get curious if there's something that is there for you that you're maybe not allowing or Back in the day, I probably had judgments on accountants as being kind of fastidious and a bit boring. And then after a while, I learned, actually being able to be with that kind of detail is really important. And I don't have a relationship with that kind of detail. And therefore, I'm a bit limited there. Let me learn how to be with detail. I was always such a big picture guy that I was almost like, I don't really want to talk about that.
Yeah.
And then realizing, that's really valuable to be able to do that. I may not want to be an accountant, but now it's almost like I'm more whole because I don't just get frustrated when something doesn't work in my car and I want someone else to fix it. It's like I can kind of get a bit more curious about what's actually there.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So I'm hearing a couple themes there. One is looking at the things that are in people's blind spots.
Yes.
Helping foster integration, a more integrated kind of complete way of looking at things.
Yes.
Yep. And this aspect of curiosity that you're talking about seems like a core tenet in what you do and what you facilitate. And what's interesting about this is I'm also noticing the paradox of I know that there's a certain identity that you have a persona, or however you want to call it, of being a teacher, right? Persona, coach,
Right. Teacher.
And the teacher component is fascinating because it's not like you're teaching necessarily people how to do things your way.
Right.
Right? But there's almost like a teaching there, but it's more helping people install their own teacher internally so
Right.
that they can start to follow and listen to themselves
Their own
rather than be
guidance.
listening to you.
Yeah. Then maybe there is a bit of a paradox in that. I know I've certainly appreciated spiritual teachers that orient in that way.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I don't want you to be my follower.
Yeah.
I want to invite you into your own guidance. That just seems, I'm not saying it's even true, it just is what resonates with me.
Who's been your greatest influence these days? And maybe just bring us through a little bit of what does that arc of that look like? I know Tony Robbins was a big one.
Tony Robbins,
when you were
because
younger,
he was the second guy that I worked for. So that my first ever short-term contract out of university was working for Dale Carnegie. Dale Carnegie himself died in like the 1950s, but there's a franchise. And then I went to work for some guys that promoted Tony Robbins in London. And that was just a super powerful time because it's such a different view of reality than you get going to Cambridge, this 800-year-old university.
Yeah.
Right? And then suddenly there's someone like Tony Robbins claiming he's got a PhD in results. And you're like, no, you don't get PhDs in results, but I get what you're talking about. That's really interesting.
It's great marketing.
Right. Yeah. And basically, for the first time in my life, I met people who were probably anti-academic, right? Rather than it being like, wow, you've done so well academically, that's like, we hold it up. They're like, but what can you do? And that was like a different conversation. And I started hanging out with entrepreneurs. And a lot of the most successful entrepreneurs don't do well in formal education, but they're very good at being hands-on or sensing timing or making things happen. So I kind of just hung out with a different crowd, basically. More recently, for a while I was into David Allen, getting things done. And that really helped me at the time sort of simplify my life. I was always so scattered and had so many projects and so many ideas, so many aspirational things on my calendar, so many yogas that I never even went to that would just be repeat events on my calendar. And David Allen's work got me to see, I'm being what he calls a crazy maker, and I actually need to get more in touch with order and control. And that's where I think I started to value that polarity or that vector of reality much more, and got much better at making fewer commitments and honoring my commitments. And I think that also brought me into more sort of like David Data style stuff, like, stand behind your commitments, know your word. It just kind of tidied up, I think, some of the edges of my masculine integrity. And then I was in Diamond Heart, as you know, for a while.
Yeah.
So I think that had a big influence. The main, it's kind of like a spiritual development school, but their main method is inquiry and getting very curious about what's arising in your experience and being very allowing of your experience, not trying to, I shouldn't be angry right now. Notice like, I'm angry right now, and can I express that and not make a story out of it? And Anthony DeMello's book Awareness made quite a big impact on me. Some of Eckhart Tolle's work kind of resonated with me, and this was stuff
all in the same realm of Diamond Heart, would you say? Like almost cousins, sister, brother, siblings, and in terms of the way they're approaching self-development or self-actualization?
Well, those three, Anthony DeMello, Eckhart Tolle, and Diamond Heart, they sit quite easily in me.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're exactly cousins. I felt like I was drawn to people like Eckhart Tolle, even though originally I was like, I'm finding it really hard to be accepting of who he is, like the way that he talks, or the sort of ponderous nature of his kind of delivery. Coming from the world of Tony Robbins, right, who's just about the most charismatic stage communicator. It was like these are quite different. They're quite different worlds. I think Eckhart Tolle and Hamid, who's the founder of Diamond Heart, are probably both scholars archetypically, and probably both fives enneagrammatically. So there's kind of a similar feel. It's a lot to do with witnessing and not attaching and being okay with and allowing. And that, I think, is something that just resonates kind of just naturally with me. Like, I think even as a teenager or as a kid, I would sometimes be inviting people to let go and like, don't be too attached to that. Like, it doesn't have to go a certain way. Annie DeMello is actually a Catholic. He was like a Jesuit priest, and but who was Indian. So he's basically an integral guy, because he's taken this kind of like Western sort of Catholicism, but he gets a lot of the Indian, like Eastern teachings and mystical teachings. So yeah, they all just kind of came about at the right time for me.
And how did all of this, and just it's so fascinating, how did all of this turn into you beginning to teach dating and relationship advice? And how do you see that this, not just the path, but how does all of this relate to perhaps the unique angle and the philosophy that you communicate and put out there in the world?
Well, I've been coaching full-time for about 7 years. Prior to that, I was coaching teens, but mostly I would lead programs more as like a course director or as a plenary speaker. And one of the things I noticed, even though I'd have clients that were like small business owners and entrepreneurs, normally for me, the most alive conversations were the ones that were to do with emotional, relational, and spiritual content. And after a while, I was like, we can talk about like with this strategy, double your business. But it's not like that really keeps me awake at night being like, let's wrestle with that. That's kind of tactical. And I have somewhat of a brain for it, but there's other people that are way more into that and way more, that's their line of creativity. And for me, it was like, the deeper the conversation goes, the more I feel alive in the coaching relationship. So I think that was part of it, and realizing that's where the kind of the draw and the turn on is. I think the second thing was having a bias in my coaching clientele with women, and noticing that women often wanted to get into these topics, and they would suddenly be like, now we're talking about it, I feel really stuck about this guy and I'm seeing him. So it just sort of started naturally to come in the conversation. I think 3 was our connection, and talking about wanting to work together, and you being heavily plugged into this world. Yeah. And kind of being open to it. Like, it was like, I really see how this could be a very concrete sort of meeting people where they're at with their problems. Like, noticing, a lot of us are trying to figure out this new world of relationships, and it's not going that well for a lot of us. And then having the humility to look at my own path and be like, I've always considered myself a relational guy, nice guy, helpful guy, easy to get on with people, so on and so forth. And that was probably even more true back in the day. Now I'm probably a little bit more like, I don't necessarily over effort in ways that I used to. But realizing, just because you can connect easily with a lot of people, that's a very different thing than can I make a long-term relationship work? And me just having to wake up to that. I think having the experience that I had with my brief ex-wife, and her eventually going and being with a woman, and just kind of like, totally opened up new paradigms. I think then having an intense series of lots of connections and relationships, and realizing, I've had more adult relationships than a lot of people have in their entire life. And there are some patterns here. And I'm kind of needing to go and figure this stuff out and take it more seriously than I have. So I feel like I come with a sort of school of hard knocks, humility. I'm in this with you. I'm learning. I'm not the guy who got, settled down as an 18-year-old and has, had his 30-year marriage and is preaching from that place. I'm like, relationships are complex, and the terrain has changed, and the language needs to get more sophisticated, and our awareness needs to get more sophisticated. And then I think fourthly, just meeting people who talked about relationship as path. And honestly, when I first heard that, it sounded kind of wanky to me. It was like, relationship as path. And then I got it. Just like any of these things. When I first came to Boulder, everyone was healing, and I was like, healing. And then eventually it's like, I get it in a different way.
For anybody that's watching, what does relationship as path actually mean?
Well, it means that you're using relationship as the surface or the crucible within which your inner work, your own unfoldment and enlightenment and integration can happen. So it's almost a bit like a spiritual path. That's what people mean by it, that it's, working with your triggers, working with your shadow, working with your blind spots, working with the places where you limit yourself or don't love yourself or don't love another person. That could be your biggest playground, your biggest playing field of development, rather than relationship is about securing one and then having a relationship. It's like, no, this is actually like we're growing and challenging each other. And it got me to realize that most of my relationships hadn't really had conflict. And that they'd been kind of premised upon harmony and realizing like, oh, actually there's a lot more truth. And that's been a big swing for me, I'd say in the last 5 years, is just being much more oriented towards what's true, even if it's inconvenient, even if it's hard to communicate, even if it creates disruption.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, as I hear you talking too, it's, I'm seeing in one paradigm, if relationship's not path, it might be something that's static, right? It's just this static thing of like what you're saying, either you have one or you don't have one. But with this idea of relationship as path, it becomes a portal or a gateway to the work that you end up doing. And what do you think, where do you think that path leads, right? If someone's actually looking at relationship as path and they're on that path, what is that path? Where is it ultimately taking them?
Probably freedom and love. And maybe ultimately there's kind of two sides of the same coin, or they're kind of deeply intertwined. Perhaps as men or people with masculine essence, perhaps freedom is often the highest value, and maybe people with a feminine essence, it's more love. That's something that I've heard suggested that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But this sort of ability to be deeply true and yourself. Yeah. That you're free to be yourself, that your partner's free to be themselves, and that it's almost like, I don't know if it's that we ever get here, but sort of just to hold up the kind of the ideal type of this, it would be like, you don't really have wounds, you don't really have triggers, you don't really have strategies to keep yourself safe, you don't really have childhood strategies that you're still operating as an adult. There's a little bit more of a sense of like undefended, unwounded, unstrategized, free, open, whole, raw.
It sounds like in some ways the Garden of Eden of relationship.
Maybe.
Right, to get to that place, that the holy grail of just being fully exposed and not shutting down and not letting your past dictate how you're showing up in the present. Yeah.
I don't think it would be like a sort of state experience of the Garden of Eden. I don't think it's just like, it's just wondrous, bountiful unity, or I think it's definitely being with everything, right? Which could be like super joy through to like real sadness. Yeah. But it's free. It's okay to be that. It's all allowed. It's all possible. And I think in relationship, it would be that you also can, securely attached, completely unattached, right? So like the attachment is really good. You have a secure attachment with your partner, but you're also unattached about a lot of like, it has to look a certain way, go a certain way, that it can be a real path that unfolds rather than, I know where we need to be in 10 years. Maybe I don't. Maybe I have absolutely zero idea who I really am in 10 years. And trusting that, a soul knows how to unfold. It doesn't necessarily need my ideas about what it's meant to be. Like an acorn knows how to become a tree. Maybe your soul knows how it needs to mature, and you can just keep providing the nutrition, something like that.
One of the things that's fascinating about relationship is we've got this one paradigm that is it's based in spirituality, right? Yes. Relationship as path. And then we've got this very animalistic, biological, neurological look at relationship. We talk about attachment theory, right? And how a child is raised and what happens specifically in their younger years that affects their dating life. If we were to meld both worlds, and I'm curious if you could take a stab at this, what do you think it is that you can take from the spiritual realm that may help somebody move more into secure attachment? Do you see those two things overlap at all? That there's something from here that can fit into this, that where they go together rather than they're mutually exclusive? Because I feel like in the past there has been this kind of mutual exclusivity of relationship versus spirituality. Like a lot of people that are really on a spiritual path are single because they're doing the work on themselves. Right? And that's the main relationship that works. But then relationship as path, it seems like it does start to mold these two together a little bit.
I think that's right.
Yeah,
I think that's right. historically in spiritual traditions, I think they used to talk about 3 paths. And I think one of them was more like a monastic path, right? Where you go and retreat from life.
Okay.
I think maybe one of them was more of like a devotional path where you go and like sit with the guru. And then one of them was more of a householder path where you actually try and live this through responsibilities, through a family, a career, a partnership, having a home. And that path, I think, is much more what's sort of available to a lot of us now, because I don't think we necessarily want to be like, yeah, I'm just going to retreat up the mountain for 25 years. It's sort of like, some people call it living a lived realization, that you can be on the spiritual path and yet very much in the world and, have a kind of a normal life. My imagination is that if you think of it in sort of spheres of development, probably people who've done the monastic path or certain kinds of spiritual development, they've just probably been very developed in certain domains of being human and probably severely underdeveloped or limited in their development in other realms. If you're doing relationship as path, it's almost like you're dialing up the different dials at the same time. That's sort of how I think about it.
So in some ways doing your own spiritual development while being fully engaged in relationship and using that to reflect back to this.
Right. Yeah. I think it's because the integral age is sort of here and upon us.
What is the integral age?
Well, I think the integral age is it's sort of like a stage of individual and cultural development. So what I mean is there's an orientation that some of us have now towards taking these different truths that exist in different realms and kind of bringing them into a more integrated reality. So like one way of looking at that would be like Eastern and Western ideas are now coming together, and a lot of us have influence from both of those realms, or like traditional Western medicine or alternative and complementary medicine. These realms are coming together. I think you go to an integrative medical doctor, right? That's someone who gets that both of these, that if we include both of them, we have a greater truth, we have a greater wisdom. And my imagination is someone that can live some spiritual truths in the context of being in an actual securely attached or we're working on it relationship is probably just more integrated than someone who, even I could ask you in your own life, probably, if you're anything like me, most of your triggers aren't coming when you're sat alone in a room, right? Maybe you get anxious or frustrated, but for most of us, I think most of the time when we get triggered, it's with another person, right? It's with our partner, it's with something to do with our work, it's with a barista that serves us in a way that we don't like. So there's a whole body of work around that when you do it, I think it makes some of this sort of realization or spiritual life more real, more kind
of points out the places where we can put our attention.
Yeah, points out the places where you're unhealed or you are defended or you're wounded that you wouldn't necessarily, I think, have to discover if you were just in a cave meditating. You might burn through all sorts of other problems, but I think there are real, most of us are deeply social beings when we're animals and we're mammals. And so we need those kind of secure attachments. And I don't think the traditional spiritual teachings necessarily answer those problems for people by just saying that, sort of don't be attached. That doesn't necessarily answer, well, how do you not be attached but have secure attachment? Or do you not need secure attachment? I think you probably do. Most of us do.
What do you think it is that at this point in your life, in having coached and been in this realm for 7 years now, where do you see things going? And is there a distillation of the message that you have in the realm of relationship thus far that you feel is most present and maybe the highest evolution of what you've had so far, of where you've been so far?
Do you mean on my personal journey, or you mean what I'm like bringing into the world?
Yeah,
or
if they're different,
like
totally. Yeah, and if they're the same, yeah, maybe it's one.
I'm just a narcissist. Well, this attention that we've had it jointly in our work, in a sense, right? So this focus on essence, right, being yourself, and that being yourself is a great platform to bring in relationship. I still think for me personally, there's a lot to learn about how to fully integrate my essence into relationship, right? That there are places where I may not quite feel myself, or I notice I may like have some internal conflict or some things that I maybe diminish my power, or I don't know how to stay open. Like I still think there's so much territory to be learned there.
Man, I can relate to that.
Yeah, totally. Humbling but powerful. I think on my channel, I have, with some people, a reputation for being able to share what might be difficult truths or introduce difficult ideas, but with a sense of gentleness or compassion. Like I get that this is hard and we still need to talk about it because it's really important. And I think there's a whole realm for me personally how to do that better in relationship, right? That it's sometimes easier to do that when we're not in connection in a certain way, when the connection is through a channel or teacher, audience, or whatever the situation is. Than to do that in the places where it personally impacts me more. Like there's more personal impact that's on the line, and realizing that I've sort of made this journey a little bit from harmony to truth. Right now I'm hoping that I can integrate those. I think I have to some extent, and probably more to come. So I'm more comfortable banding around, calling a spade, as we would say, and yet realizing how to do that when it might be super sensitive to call a spade, and just how to really navigate that and kind of be with the difficult territory and conversations that can come up. Longer term, I'm curious if any of this for me is going to come into a little bit more of a sort of social, political, global arena, right? That when we met, I was a lot more into the conversations about global citizenship and global governance. And I really dialed back my attention on that and put it much more squarely in how can I help the people that are immediately in front of me. And that conversation hasn't been as loud, but there is a sort of curiosity of like, if you can have a really truthful conversation that is super sensitive, and I think I've got way lot to learn about that, but that feels like a really useful skill when countries are trying to negotiate things, or groups are trying to figure out how do we take care of, like, water is a precious resource. People are saying the next wars are going to be fought around water. Well, how could we not go to war about that and actually be in the vulnerable conversation of this is difficult because you need water and I need water, and I don't want to see you thirsty and you don't want to see me thirsty, but when I'm scared I kind of diminish you and your needs and I kind of up my own needs or whatever I do there. Like that for me is kind of fascinating. Like we've got so many complex global issues, climate change, people are very afraid of climate change right now, a lot of eco-anxiety. Like how are we going to come together and have those conversations to create better outcomes? Because at the moment, if I'm a liberal and you're a conservative, we're kind of screwed off the bat. Like we can't hear each other. I don't really think you've got anything valuable to add. You think I'm kind of stupid with my liberal idealism. And I think we've got to go somewhere better than that. And that's where the integral worldview is so powerful, because it says, you're a conservative, of course there's something really valuable that you're honoring when you speak. And if I can recognize that, I actually can see your value rather than
discount you completely.
Just othering you, discounting you. And so there's a little bit of excitement there for me of how to do that. I want to work with more couples and do that in relationships. I want to figure that out in my own relationship. It's like lots of creating intimacy around conversations that matter and having them in a better way.
I hear you. The journey sounds like you were focused on the macro, the larger picture of things, and now it's like you've taken a break or a step back from that, and you're really focusing on the essentials of just one-on-one individual relationship, how people are showing up, because you're recognizing that is the foundation. It's almost like looking at the atom to understand how these larger complex systems actually work and how they're really built. And that when it comes down to it, it's the same thing that is repeating everywhere.
Right. Or maybe, or I want that inquiry. But it's almost like super simplistic. There's relationship with self, there's relationship with one other, and then there's a relationship with, big other, the group, life, the world. And I feel like I've done a lot here and I'm doing a lot here, and then who knows about that? But it seems very rare for me that I hear someone in a more political or social cultural context talk with an awareness of the kind of things that, say, you and I are teaching. Right? Where like, oh, I might have said something that's triggered you. Like, how can I be supportive of that rather than just kind of bash you over the head because you're now triggered? You know, or how can I be aware that you naming your truth is bringing up something for me, and include it and get vulnerable about it, rather than just sort of posturing up and just trying to squash you with a better argument. You know, the game of like posturing up dudes trying to have better arguments to one up each other, that is not going to solve climate change in my view. So we actually need a better technology to engage with.
Sounds like transferring out of the paradigm of zero sum.
That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, but even the vulnerability, you know, the moment in most political arenas, you kind of have to come with an answer. Here's my answer, follow me. And the real thing would be to say, I might be a super smart dude. I haven't got an answer to this. I've got some ideas. How can we build on them? But that doesn't get you elected. That's not a platform, but it's just more real. It doesn't seem to me that there's much authenticity and realness in these realms. And I think that's that through line for me. You know, how can you have a more real, how can we prioritize the real rather than the fake or the ego? Yeah. Would be another way of saying that.
I love it. And I'm noticing too that there's so many different tributaries and roads that we can follow in this conversation and go deeper. But I'm also aware that I think we may be at time, and I know that you've got to hit the road. So if people have resonated with your message, they want to learn more about you, they want to see what it is that you are up to these days. How can they follow the conversation?
Well, definitely click the link below this video and go over to my channel. Would love to have you subscribe to my channel.
Do it.
I'd also say, you know, if you're more interested in if you've enjoyed our connection in this, like hopefully you'll link our webinar under this as well, because that's a good opportunity. That's like the front end of our kind of combined work together.
Totally.
Also, maybe if you want, you can post my Instagram. Like Instagram and YouTube are the two places that I really kind of show up for ongoing content creation.
Yeah, it's great stuff. Check it out. Jack's always got a very, I think, connected and authentic place that he comes from when he speaks and teaches, and it's been a massive influence on my life, and really happy to be working with this guy and creating a body of content that we can put out into the world in the realm of a place where people experience so much pain in dating and relationships. So definitely click those links below, check it out. And Jack, dude, thanks for coming, man.
Hey, thanks for having me,
appreciate it, dude.
It's been great.
Yeah,
how
awesome.
deep. Appreciate it.
Yeah. All right, take care, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.